There's a photograph that still hangs in the back room of the cooperative feed store in Millbrook Falls, and if you ask anyone over 60 around there, they'll tell you the story behind it without you even finishing the question. It's a picture of 31 calves, so thin you could count their ribs through a camera lens, standing in a mud lot behind a barn that was barely standing itself. Nobody wanted those calves. The auction barn couldn't even give them away. But an old man named Walter Pruitt drove out there on a Tuesday morning with a beat-up trailer and bought every single one of them for almost nothing. People said he'd lost his mind. They said grief does strange things to a man. What they didn't know, what nobody could have known that morning, was that 2 years later, those same 31 calves would change not just Walter's life, but the lives of nearly everyone in that small town. This is the story of how a broken man, a herd nobody believed in, and one stubborn kind of love brought a community back from the edge. Before we begin, if you enjoy emotional stories like this one, take a second to subscribe to the channel. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel and which part of the world you're joining us from. Now let's go back to where it all started. Walter Pruitt was 68 years old the spring this story begins, and if you'd passed him on the road, you might not have looked twice. He was the kind of man small towns are built on and often forget to notice, broad-shouldered but stooped now, with hands so weathered they looked like the bark of the old oak tree behind his farmhouse. He'd lived his whole life in the same 200-acre stretch of land outside a town called Millbrook Falls, a place small enough that everyone still waved at passing cars, whether they recognized the driver or not. Walter had been a cattleman his entire adult life, just like his father before him and his father's father before that. For 45 years, he and his wife Doris had run that farm together. She handled the books and the chickens and somehow always knew which cow was about to calve before the cow did. He worked the fields and mended the fences and learned, slowly, the patience that cattle demand from a man. They never had much money, but they had enough, and more than that, they had each other. And for a long time, that felt like the same thing. Then 18 months before our story begins, Doris passed away after a short illness that the local doctors never quite agreed on. One week she was canning tomatoes in the kitchen, singing along to the radio the way she always did, slightly off-key and not caring one bit. 6 weeks later she was gone. Walter buried her on a Thursday in October, under a sky the color of wet ash, and something in him went quiet that never fully came back on. His routine after that became small and gray. He fed what few cattle remained, he'd sold off most of the herd to cover medical bills, and he sat in the evenings in a kitchen that echoed too much. His daughter Sarah, who lived 2 hours away in the city, called every Sunday, and every Sunday she heard the same flat voice telling her he was doing all right. She didn't believe him. Neither did his neighbors, who started leaving casseroles on his porch that went uneaten more often than not. People in Millbrook Falls liked Walter, they respected him, but there's a particular kind of loneliness that respect alone can't touch, and by that spring everyone could see it sitting on him like a coat he couldn't take off. He wasn't sleeping. He'd lost weight. The barn that Doris used to walk through every morning greeting the animals like old friends had gone mostly silent. Walter's only real companion in those months was a dog named Scout, an aging blue heeler who'd belonged to Doris and who now followed Walter everywhere, as if making sure he didn't wander too far from the world of the living. Folks who saw him at the feed store said he'd become a man just going through motions, paying bills, fixing what broke, waiting for nothing in particular. What none of them knew, what Walter himself probably couldn't have explained, was that somewhere underneath all that grief, something was still alive in him. Something that needed a reason to keep getting up at 5 in the morning. He just hadn't found it yet. What Walter wanted more than anything, though he might not have said it out loud to a single soul, was a reason to care again. Not to forget Doris. He never wanted that, not for 1 second, but to find something that could hold the same kind of devotion she had poured into that farm for 45 years. He wanted purpose. He wanted his hands to matter again. He wanted, somewhere deep down, to prove to himself that he still had something left to give, even after losing the person who had given him a reason to give it. He didn't know it yet, but that purpose was about to show up looking like the last thing anyone would want, a truckload of dying calves. The trouble started, as these things often do, almost by accident. Walter had driven into the regional livestock auction one Tuesday, mostly out of habit more than need, just to see familiar faces and feel like part of something for an hour or two. That's when he saw them, penned off in a corner away from the main auction floor, 31 calves that had come from a failed operation 2 counties over. The story going around the barn was ugly. The previous owner had gotten sick himself, fallen behind on care, and by the time the bank and the county stepped in, the animals were in rough shape, underfed, several with respiratory infections, a few so weak they could barely stand. The auctioneer wasn't even going to run them through the main sale. Buyers took one look and shook their heads. Too much risk, too much vet cost, too little promise. Someone joked that the kindest thing would be to put them down rather than try to save them. Walter stood at that pen for a long time. Scout sat beside the truck waiting, the way dogs do when they sense their person has stopped moving for a reason. The other ranchers there knew Walter's situation, knew about Doris, knew he'd downsized his herd, knew frankly that he probably shouldn't be taking on a financial gamble like this. His neighbor, a big man named Hollis Tate, came up beside him and said what everyone was thinking. Walter, those calves are more trouble than they're worth. Let it go. But Walter didn't let it go. Something about those thin, frightened animals standing in that mud, written off by everyone who looked at them, struck a nerve in him he didn't fully understand at the time. Maybe it was grief talking. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe some part of him recognized something of himself in them, broken, underestimated, not quite given up on by everyone but close. He bought all 31 for a price so low, the auctioneer almost refused to write the ticket, worried Walter didn't understand what he was getting into. The conflict wasn't just about money, though that mattered plenty. The real conflict was about doubt from his neighbors, from his daughter when she found out, and most painfully from Walter himself late at night staring at the ceiling, wondering if he'd just made the worst decision since Doris died. Sarah called that Sunday in a panic. "Dad, you can barely take care of yourself. What are you doing with 31 sick animals?" Hollis Tate told anyone who'd listened down at the feed store that Walter Pruitt had finally cracked. The vet, a young woman named Dr. Naomi Reyes, who'd only been practicing in the county for 2 years, looked over the calves and gave Walter an honest assessment. At least a third of them might not make it through the month, no matter what he did. For the first time since Doris's funeral, Walter had something enormous in front of him that demanded everything he had left. The question was whether he had anything left to give. There were things about that herd, and about Walter's choice, that didn't add up right away, small mysteries that would only make sense much later. For one, Walter insisted on naming every single calf, something he'd never done in 45 years of ranching. Cattlemen don't usually name livestock meant for sale. It complicates things emotionally and practically. But Walter sat down with an old notebook of Doris's, one she'd used for her garden journal, and gave each of the 31 animals a name, most of them taken from people and places out of his and Doris's life together. His neighbors found this strange. Sarah found it stranger still, and more than a little worrying. Then there was the matter of the old bottom pasture, a 40-acre stretch of land along the creek that Walter hadn't used in over a decade, not since a flood years back had made him wary of it. Everyone assumed he'd keep the recovering calves in the smaller, safer pens near the barn. Instead, within the first 2 weeks, Walter began quietly clearing brush and mending fence line down by that creek, working alone most evenings until dark, telling no one exactly why. And then there was Dr. Reyes's visits. What started as standard veterinary check-ins became something else. She began showing up more often than the calves strictly required, staying longer than billing hours would suggest, and the two of them could often be seen standing at the fence line in long conversations that neighbors couldn't quite overhear. Was it about the cattle? About something else? Hollis Tate, never one to keep an opinion to himself, started speculating around town, and not always kindly. Perhaps strangest of all, about 3 months in, a stranger's truck started appearing at the end of Walter's driveway every other Saturday, an older man nobody in town recognized, who would sit in his truck for a few minutes, watch the pasture, and then drive away without ever getting out. Walter never explained who it was, not even when Sarah asked him directly. He'd just say, "I've got a guess. I'll know for sure when he's ready to say it himself," and change the subject. These threads, the names, the abandoned pasture, the vet's lingering visits, the mysterious truck, would each eventually unravel into something meaningful. But for now, they hung over Millbrook Falls like a held breath, fueling gossip at the feed store and questions Walter wasn't ready to answer. The first weeks were brutal. 3 calves died within the first 10 days despite Walter and Dr. Reyes working around the clock, bottle feeding the weakest ones every 4 hours, sometimes sleeping in the barn on a cot Doris used to use when calving season ran long. Walter took each loss hard, harder than seemed reasonable for a man who'd buried animals before. Sarah worried out loud during their Sunday calls that he was pouring grief for her mother into something he couldn't control, setting himself up to be broken all over again. But then came small victories that felt enormous. A calf named Birdie, Walter had named her after Doris's grandmother, turned a corner nobody expected, going from barely standing to butting playfully against the fence rail within a week. The morning Walter watched her actually run across the pen for the first time, Hollis Tate happened to be driving by and later told people he saw Walter Pruitt laughing out loud, alone in a pasture for the first time since the funeral. There was fear too, real fear, the kind that comes from financial risk a man his age couldn't easily absorb. Vet bills piled up. A summer storm knocked out fencing along the creek pasture right after Walter had finished clearing it, undoing weeks of work in a single night, and he sat on his porch steps afterward with his head in his hands while Scout pressed against his leg. There was anxiety in town too as word spread. Some neighbors thought Walter was finally healing. Others, like Hollis, worried he was avoiding his grief rather than facing it, throwing himself into work the way some men do instead of dealing with what's underneath. Sarah drove out more often that summer, torn between pride in her father's resilience and a quiet fear that he was risking a heartbreak he couldn't survive twice. And there was surprise, the town slowly noticing that Walter wasn't just nursing sick animals back to health. He was rebuilding something. The bottom pasture, once considered ruined ground, was being restored acre by acre. Local teenagers, hearing about the project through their parents, started showing up on weekends to help, partly out of curiosity, partly because Walter, without quite realizing it, had become something of a local legend, the man who bought the calves nobody wanted. By late summer, 26 of the original 31 calves were thriving. Healthy, growing, grazing on restored pasture land that hadn't fed cattle in over a decade. The transformation was undeniable. But the biggest emotional turn of the story was still ahead. The mysterious truck at the end of the driveway finally stopped one Saturday in late August, and the old man inside it finally stepped out. Walter walked down to meet him, and Sarah, who happened to be visiting that weekend, watched from the porch as her father shook the stranger's hand like he'd been expecting him all along. The man's name was Eli Sanderson, and it turned out he was the son of the rancher who had originally owned those 31 calves, the man whose illness and financial collapse had led to the animals being abandoned at auction in the first place. Eli had been too ashamed to approach Walter directly after everything that happened to his father's operation, but he'd been driving out every other Saturday just to watch, from a distance, what had become of the animals his family once raised. He'd heard around the county that someone had bought the whole lot and was somehow bringing them back to life. What Eli told Walter that afternoon put everything that had happened that summer in a different light. His father, it turned out, hadn't simply fallen on hard times by chance. He'd spent his final working years trying and ultimately failing to revive that exact same bottom pasture grazing method Walter had been quietly restoring all summer. A slower, rotational system that took years to pay off but produced healthier cattle and richer land in the long run. Eli's father had been a generation ahead of his time, attempting it without enough capital or community support, and the project, along with his health, had collapsed under the strain. Eli had always believed his father's idea died with him. Walter, without ever having heard a word of this man's history, had stumbled into finishing what Eli's father started, using the very calves bred from that same line, on land suited to that very method, guided by instincts 45 years of ranching had quietly built in him. It wasn't coincidence so much as two broken men, a generation apart, circling the same unfinished idea until a herd nobody wanted became the bridge between them. Sarah, listening from the porch, finally understood why the abandoned bottom pasture had pulled at her father the way it had, and why Dr. Reyes had kept finding reasons to stay late at the fence line. She'd trained briefly under Eli's father years before, and had recognized the grazing method the moment she saw what Walter was attempting, even before she knew the full story behind it. Picture the bottom pasture as it looked that August evening. Knee-high grass swaying gold and green in the last hour of daylight, the creek running low and clear after a dry summer week, and 26 calves, no longer calves really, but young cattle now, sturdy and unbothered, grazing in loose clusters across land that had sat empty and overgrown for more than 10 years. Walter stood at the fence line in his usual flannel shirt, sleeves rolled to the elbow, his boots caked in the pale dust of a long day's work. Scout lay in the shade nearby, watching the herd the way she used to watch Doris move through the barn each morning. The light at that hour turned everything amber, catching the dust kicked up by hooves and making it shimmer like something out of an old photograph. Eli Sanderson stood a few feet off, hat in hand, eyes wet though he tried not to show it, looking out over land his father had once tried and failed to bring back to life. Sarah stood on the porch steps in the distance, arms crossed, watching her father in a posture she hadn't seen from him in over a year, shoulders back, chin up, a man standing inside something that mattered to him again. The barn behind them, once dim and silent, now had its lights on most evenings, and the low murmur of cattle settling in for the night had become a sound the whole property seemed to breathe around. Down at the feed store in town, the photograph that would eventually hang on the back wall hadn't been taken yet, but the moment was already forming. 31 calves, the impossible herd, now thriving on ground everyone had given up on, owned by a man everyone thought had lost his mind. The true turning point didn't come until the following October, more than a year after Eli first stepped out of his truck, and almost exactly 2 years after that Tuesday morning Walter drove out to the auction barn. Millbrook Falls held its annual harvest fair that fall, a modest local event that had been shrinking for years as the town's population aged and its young people moved to the city. For the first time in over a decade, the fair committee asked Walter to bring some of his cattle for the children's section, a sort of informal show where local kids could see and learn about the animals. Walter arrived with 6 of his strongest young cattle, Birdie among them, and what followed surprised everyone, including him. People who hadn't spoken more than a passing word to Walter in over a year came up to ask about the herd, about the restored bottom pasture, about how he'd managed to turn around animals everyone had written off as a lost cause. Holly's Tate, the very neighbor who told Walter to let the calves go that first day at auction, stood at the fence for a long while before finally walking over and in front of half the town, admitting he'd been wrong. He asked Walter, plainly and without pride getting in the way, if he'd be willing to teach a few of the local ranchers about the rotational grazing method that had brought that bottom pasture back from ruin. It was a small moment in the grand scheme of things, one neighbor's apology, one offer to share knowledge, but for Walter, standing there in the October sun with Doris's notebook of names still tucked in his jacket pocket, it meant something enormous. He wasn't just a grieving widower anymore in the eyes of his town. He was, again, a man with something to offer. Eli Sanderson stood nearby that day too, having become, over the years since, something between a business partner and a friend, and when Walter introduced him to the gathering crowd as the man whose family started all this, something settled into place that felt, for the first time in longer than he could measure, like closure rather than mere survival. Sarah, watching her father field questions from neighbors and shake hands with people who doubted him, finally let go of the worry she'd been carrying since the day he bought those calves. She understood, watching him there, that he hadn't been running from his grief by pouring himself into those calves. He'd been finding a way to carry it forward instead of being buried under it. By the following spring, Walter's herd had grown beyond the original 31, with several new calves born on the restored bottom pasture, the same ground that had sat fallow for a decade. He and Eli Sanderson formalized a small partnership with Eli, who had inherited some of his late father's land 2 counties over, beginning to apply the same rotational grazing methods on his own property, this time with Walter's hard-won guidance rather than going it alone the way his father once had. Holly's Tate and several other local ranchers did end up attending informal sessions Walter held at the farm most Saturday mornings, where he walked them through what he'd learned, equal parts science and stubborn instinct, about reviving worn-out pastureland and nursing struggling cattle back to strength. What began as one man's private grief project slowly became something the whole farming community in Millbrook Falls leaned on, especially as a few other small operations in the county faced their own hard seasons. Dr. Naomi Reyes continued her visits to the farm, though by then everyone in town understood they weren't strictly about the cattle anymore. She and Walter had built something quieter and steadier between them, not a replacement for what he'd had with Doris. Nothing could be that, but a genuine friendship that had grown into something more, rooted in shared respect for the work and for each other. Sarah moved back to Millbrook Falls that following year, taking a position at the regional school and helping her father manage the growing operation on weekends. She told people later that watching her father rebuild that herd had taught her something about grief she hadn't understood before, that healing doesn't always look like moving on. Sometimes it looks like picking up the thing nobody else wanted and refusing to let it go. The 31 calves that nobody believed in became, within 2 years, the foundation of a thriving herd, a restored piece of land, a renewed friendship between 2 families connected by loss, and a town that had rediscovered, through one old man's stubborn act of love, what it meant to look out for each other. That photograph still hangs in the back room of the cooperative feed store in Millbrook Falls, 31 thin, struggling calves standing in a muddy pen, the day before Walter Pruitt loaded them onto his trailer and drove them home. Beneath it, someone added a small handwritten note years later. Nobody wanted these. Look at them now. Walter never set out to teach the town a lesson. He was just a grieving man looking for a reason to keep getting up in the morning, and he found it in the most unlikely place, in animals everyone else had already given up on. But maybe that's exactly why it worked. Maybe the things and the people we're quickest to write off are sometimes the ones most capable of writing us back into our own lives if we're just willing to take the chance nobody else will. Walter still keeps Doris's old notebook in the barn, names of all 31 calves written in her handwriting style, the one he taught himself to imitate when he filled in the names she never got to give. Some nights, he says, he can almost hear her laughing about the whole thing, a house full of named cattle, a town talking, a life rebuilt out of what nobody else wanted. And maybe in the end, that's exactly the kind of foolishness love is made of. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe for more stories like this. And before you go, tell me where you're watching from and what part of this story stayed with you the most. I read as many comments as I can, and I genuinely enjoy hearing your thoughts.